Our topic today is the different energy trends of developed and developing countries. I know that Professor Cleveland Jones doesn't like the name developing countries, but he can explain us a little bit better. Welcome, Professor. It's a pleasure to have you here today again.
It's nice to be with you again, Gavanya, and to talk about trends and so on.
Uh, could you please explain why, what's the reason you don't like this expression of developing countries?
Well, economists used to have this thing: less developed countries, LDC, and developed countries. I ended up, for example, some of my slides, I follow that. But really, nowadays, it's not a question of less developed or more developed. It's really a question of what block you are in.
Yeah, that's right.
Because China, for example, by most measures, you can't call it a less developed country. On the other hand, it's in a very specific, block separate from Western Europe and the United States and so on. So these are differences, and I allude to that a little bit towards the end, where, for example, the BRICS and so on are more important as a block than the actual level of development. India, for example, is bringing up a little bit the bottom because it's quite a few years behind China.
Hmm.
So in that sense, you could say India and China, but they're very different, even though very populous, but very different development levels. Brazil, for example, and then of course everything else. Sure, if you talk about Western Europe or the United States, Australia, Japan,
Hmm.
sure. But yeah, this is a confusing topic a lot.
Yeah, that's right. If you wanted to start with your slides, it's
Yeah,
a pleasure.
let me share uh, a screen here because I think the key that we have to understand when we look at energy trends is that it is indisputably electricity versus GDP indisputable. There is no low energy rich countries. So all of the relatively poor countries want to increase their GDP, and naturally they have to increase their electricity consumption. In fact, electricity and energy. It's not just electricity, energy, oil, coal, everything else has to go up with GDP. Once you get to that top right hand corner, maybe you can see some flattening. If you get to the point where you're uh, Iceland and so on, maybe you can have more development and flatten out some of your energy
And,
demand.
and
Most countries
looking,
are very far from that.
yeah, looking at this chart, you can see Qatar in
Yeah,
the highest position, a very high GDP per capita, and very
yeah.
high energy use per capita.
But
It's good.
imagine some of these countries, OPEC countries, for example, they're energy rich in oil and gas, and they use a lot of oil and gas, if for no other reason, for petrochemical industry, for air conditioning and very hot weather, and they're wealthy, so they do have extensive air conditioning use. Almost everything is air conditioned, so you have residential, commercial use is very high per capita. So those are understandable high uses. A little bit less Canada, the United States, and
Yeah,
so
but
on.
interesting because Brazil and China is very close. They are not
Yeah,
too separated in this chart.
exactly. Because that is the path forward. And you basically have that gate. You can't get to the top right hand corner any other way by cutting corners uh, on the top or the bottom. You have to grow energy along with GDP. No country has found a way to do that and get up there. There are some countries that have very high quality of life, and as you know, some are measuring in terms of happiness index and so on. But I mean, realistically, with GDP, there's no other relationship. Maybe you can argue that some relatively poor countries in terms of GDP can have a happy population, but that's something else. We're talking about
Yeah,
economic development.
but we could say that there is a linear relationship between GDP per capita and energy.
That linear relationship holds very, very strongly, except that now we're getting to the point where a lot of Western European countries and so on, Japan, are probably at the point where additional development will not lead to significantly higher energy use because they're already, have the air conditioning, already have energy intensive industries. And in fact, they're probably aiming for efficiency gains, so their energy use is not going to go up with development. So from now on, we may see a flattening way at the top. But in the middle, where most of the countries are, and they're trying to get up there, they will have to increase energy. So there's no running away from that. That's a trend that has to happen. And if you put that together with the extreme energy poverty that you have in so many countries in the world, 2 billion people in energy poverty out of 8, that's over 25%. We've shown this slide in a couple of programs because I love it. Whereas a USA inhabitant uses more energy just for their refrigerator than a Nigerian, a Kenyan, a Ghana, many countries in Africa use all over, all for all uses. It's just an incomparably extreme disparity. And so in order to close that disparity, obviously, they will have to increase their energy use a lot. And the United States doesn't fit here. It would be way off the graph because that's just one refrigerator. If you add the heater and the air conditioning and the car and the this and the that, you're completely.
This chart is really impressive. Really.
Yeah. So, but it's important to grasp this because the differences are not just ones, two. They're in the tens and in the hundreds of times different. Can you imagine a U.S. citizen or a Japanese citizen? They are using 100 times more energy than inhabitants of many other countries. It's just an incredible disparity. But this is what drives politics in those countries. The policies for those countries have to be geared to increase the well-being of their population. So this applies to a lot of the BRIC countries that we discussed. Sure, China and Russia, for example, at a different stage in development than India and a couple of other countries, but their importance is that they're joining a bloc. And now the world is more and more polarized by blocs, not by poverty status or wealth status. So it is imperative for these countries to join together, to be stronger in terms of resisting pressures from the U.S. and Western Europe blocs and so on. So we spoke a while back about BRICS expansion, and now it's already there. But now that we have the expansion and it's continuing, even new countries are about to join. We're now talking the policies that these countries are implementing, all the way from currency and so on.
And came to my mind a question for you, please. Does the world has enough energy to face the inclusion of people in the new level of consumption?
Well, the answer is that it has, as long as that growth is gradual, because there is no way to accelerate that and make 20 years fit into 5. So the fact that a lot of these poorer countries are going to take 20 years to get there is what makes it possible, because in 20 years, yes, we will be able to develop not just conventional fossil fuels, but also some renewable energies and so on. So this is the reality of the world. We can't, and if you compare this, for example, with the G7, okay, now we have G20, many of the countries in G20, the US, Russia, and so on, are also in BRICS. But the comparison that I think is pertinent is the hardcore wealthy countries, the bloc, that bloc is so few countries. The only little dot in South America is because Guyana is there. It's basically just an extension of France, not that it counts. But it's just Japan, Western Europe, and the US. Everything else is another bloc. And we have to look at the world in this way. Sure, Africa is gigantic, South America gigantic, Asia, Eurasia is gigantic. But what counts is the blocks in which the world is segregating itself, and ever more so. We see that even in conflicts that are happening.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. But the renewable energy in developing countries and developed countries are two different.
Well, this is an important distinction because while we can say, and I think I'll just go one slide here. It's important to understand that China and India, which are the most populous countries in the world, will remain oil and gas poor, not necessarily energy poor, because they're both developing alternatives. Both, China is developing wind and solar. It's using coal as much as possible, and so on, and so is India. But they will remain fossil energy poor, other than coal. So their policies are focused on overcoming that shortfall. They will remain heavily dependent on coal imports because as much as they produce coal, they still can't meet all of their demand. This is a characteristic that is different because a lot of the BRICS and that bloc have countries that have very rich oil and gas reserves, rich energy resources in coal and others. And you also have poor countries that almost have no major resources. India is a case in point. There's no large nuclear based sources. It has some coal, but not enough to meet its demand. It's oil and gas poor. Renewable energies are still not a significant source of energy supply. So you have a mix. In the BRICS, for example, everything counts. Oil, gas, coal, renewables. And China is pouring out renewable energy equipment as fast as it can, flooding the world with solar panels and wind turbines and so on. And less developed countries, as long as they have financing from China, are taking that up. Differently than the more developed countries because they are more selective. They are not going to invest heavily in new coal, as we just discussed recently. Coal finally phased out in the UK, but that's a significant development for Western Europe and so on. Maybe later for the US because we're having a lot of coal there.
Professor, let me interrupt you to put a chart. You can be back very soon. But in this case of UK, the UK closed the last coal power station last days, and the other side, in the middle of this chart, you have a number of coal plants in several countries, including China, more than 1,000.
And going up. which is what I said. This group is everything counts. They will go for coal. They will go for nuclear energy, like China is doing. They are going for solar panels, but the Western Europe, for example, is not doing that. It's basically focusing. Yes, maybe some nuclear revitalization in the U.S. is certainly focusing on renewable energy in large part supplied by China. So this is a dichotomy. The BRICS are supplying a lot of the resources that developed countries are using, including minerals and so on. But this is what the real difference is, because Africa and India still have a chance to, for example, develop biofuels, such as Brazil, which is a big biofuel producer. Whereas, Western Europe and even the U.S., other than the ethanol in the U.S., has probably reached near a plateau. But in other countries, Southeast Asia, Africa, that is a growth area. And that indicates that all of the above is what counts. China will stress wind and solar and storage and electric vehicles because it's betting on everything and it has the capital to do that. But it's important also to keep in mind that specifically in coal, like you pointed out, in developed countries, the concern is emissions of greenhouse gases, SOx and NOx, NOx and SOx, particulate pollution, and so on, high environmental footprint of mining.
But China doesn't believe on this
No.
metrics.
This more in developed countries, I don't include China here. This is the difference I would suggest non-BRICS blocks as opposed to the BRICS, because China is definitely doesn't have anything against coal. It is planning to supplement coal and eventually to substitute it, but that's not a high priority. Its high priority is meeting energy needs of its population. And that's the same thing in India, for example. But in less developed countries and a lot of the BRICS, coal it has no negative impacts that are politically relevant. Yes, people die from pollution in many of those countries. In India in particular, that's a serious problem. In some cities in China, coal plants, not just car pollution, are a very serious health problem because they don't have precipitators in their stacks and so on. But as an a national energy policy, they can be brought on stream very quickly, very cheaply. $10 to add 1 million watt hours per year. If you're talking wind and solar, that's 60, 70 times more. Sure, China has the capital to do that, but it's only going to do that while mixing cheap coal. But very importantly, coal has big advantages, which is not going to be abandoned by these countries because coal is much more difficult to restrict in terms of embargoes and so on if there were to be pressures from developed countries. And geopolitics is a very important concern for the BRICS and the less developed countries. It insulates them from pressures from the U.S. and Western Europe because coal can be sourced in many places. And it overcomes the problem of energy poverty. If you're poor, you don't have a lot of money to invest. Obviously, you invest in the cheapest source there is, which is basically coal now. Sure, solar in some cases is quite inexpensive too, but if the capex is a little high, you need China or someone to fund that capital expenditure. So that's a concern. But we have to look ahead. And looking ahead, there is no question that the world is continuing to polarize itself into these blocks. And this is reflected more than anything in energy policies, because the strengthening of the BRICS and the regional arrangements in Southeast Asia and so on, that is in direct response to pressures that those countries feel from also China, but also from Western Europe. The Southeast Asian countries are, of course, concerned about Chinese dominating the seas and so on. The Philippines is a good example. So their energy policies are also concerned with creating regional support, entering into alliances which are not very logical in some cases. For example, aligning itself with the U.S. just for protection from China. This is an example of how geopolitics trumps everything. The conflicts and the policies of the developed world accelerate this trend towards energy security. No one wants to be told what to have in terms of energy, what to use in terms of cars, and so on. So their best bet is to have an independent energy policy. That means not playing ball with Western Europe and the U.S. and these green policies of the energy transition. That's for them, not for this group. Yeah, it's still.
let,
Yeah,
let me put a question for you. Brazil is coming to face let's see, a challenge, a big challenge in the hydroelectric
yeah.
potential, because
We're getting
rivers are
maxed out.
becoming weaker and almost dry. Some of them almost dry. So
Yeah.
how do you see the energy, substitute energy for Brazil in this case of hydro decreasing?
It's not too different than in many other countries with high potential. Once you realize that potential, which is almost the case in Brazil, we don't have any mega hydroelectric projects left. We have some large ones still to develop, but we don't have any more to develop. So the focus is on the current hydroelectric potential generation, and
they are becoming dry.
Yeah, that is subject to seasonal, and of course, the more than seasonal. You can have a couple of years in a row of dry weather, and that can destroy your hydroelectric generating potential. So, for a country like Brazil and many others, maybe not in the Nordic countries, which also have hydro, but some African countries, that is already a concern because the climate change, for whatever reason you might think is happening, and they are aware. For example, all along the Nile, those hydroelectric projects are very subject to high risk of eventual drought and low generating potential. So they have to complement that with alternative sources. Brazil long ago started going into gas generating plants,
natural gas thermals,
because it knew that that's the cheap, quick base power that can substitute that. That ends up being more expensive, of course, but there's very little alternatives. But those are the models that are going to be emulated. And like I said, Africa is looking at Brazil and saying, high hydroelectric potential, but just like Brazil, if they run dry, they have to have alternatives. What is Sudan and all of those countries up the Nile going to do if their large hydroelectric projects at some point are not generating? They have to have backup. They're thinking about natural gas. They'll have to go to LNG or have to invest in polluting coal.
We could say that rich countries are investing heavily in the renewable energies, and less developed countries are still investing in fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas. Is it right? Is it correct?
It is, but then where does China fit in? Because it is investing tremendously in wind and solar, so much so that it's exporting even batteries nowadays at very, very low cost. People thought the battery costs were, as low as they could get, around 50 or 80. Now we're down to $20 per unit. That is unthinkable. And that opens up another flooding of the world market for renewable energy, because once you make batteries very inexpensive, then you open up alternatives that weren't there before. So yes, the world will use more Chinese exports of renewable energy equipment and so on, but basically the rich world with its funds, the poorer world, when China provides investment, buying influence, that kind of thing, and that's the way to go. Hey, if you need energy and the Chinese are offering you all of these solar panels and batteries and they finance it and you don't have to put up the money, that still looks good, even if there's some strings attached.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
There's definitely, the global south will lead conventional oil and gas growth in production, Because if you look at where oil and gas growth will happen in the future, we already spoke. Yes, the United States will grow a little bit. I believe Russia will fall significantly. We're all talking about, the Arctic projects in Russia, which could add 2 or maybe 3 million barrels a day. Well, that's 10 years from now. Between now and then, they could lose a lot of production for very marginal fields. So this rearrangement of energy between global north and global south is also important. And the growth areas will be Brazil, Guyana, Africa, some Southeast Asia. The United States will hold their own. A lot of other countries will come down. Middle East will hold its own.
And
So there
and
will
how
be a change.
and how do you see 2050, the arrangement of energy portfolio may become the same that you have today, or
No,
too
it,
different?
it definitely will be quite different. The advantage is that when we look at 2050, we're sufficiently far away, 25 years, that a lot can happen. And indeed, I think quite a couple months ago, we had a program where we talked about, energy transition far in the future. And I was overly optimistic in the view of many of our comments. But when you're talking 25 years in the future, and with the potential of technological innovations that can happen and bring changes so fast, a lot can happen. And indeed, I mentioned then, and I affirm now, that we will see a world that will be much more electrified, much more dependent on solar in particular, maybe not so much on wind. It will be certainly more dependent on a bigger share of the
And,
energy grid from nuclear. We're finally making inroads. A while back, we thought, nuclear is a dead end. No. Now we see
with,
major happenings in the U.S.
but
It points
with
the
the
way.
growth of intermittent energy, solar, wind, which energy will be the backup one? Natural
Well,
gas?
in 25 years, we
Yeah.
are going to see major advances in storage. So the importance of backup for the next 5, 10, maybe even 15 years will not remain in 25 years. The backup energy that we're talking as necessary now is because of intermittency. And intermittency is a problem that you can solve with storage. And if you have cheap storage,
So,
like we
so
might have in the
do you
future.
expect big batteries to solve this problem instead of natural gas?
No, I expect the batteries will be much less expensive, so they will have a bigger share. But alternative storage, and we spoke a little bit about this, even pumped storage, hydroelectric, sand storage with heat in many installations,
Mm.
geothermal, all of these energy sources, 25 years from now, we'll look back and say, hey, boy, how was it that those guys lived back then? It's
I
too
don't
far in the future.
I don't believe in geothermal and things like that for the
But
whole
but
world.
but Cavagna, look, in 25 years, I'll probably won't be here, so I don't mind making a prediction. No one is going to beat me over it. But it's easy to make those predictions when you're a believer in technology, like I am. So we'll see what happens. But for now, our focus here and for this is maybe 5, 10, 15 years, much the same uh, uh,
Yeah,
evolutionary changes, but major changes between the blocks in the world.
yeah, that's right. Excellent, Professor Cleveland Jones. A great conversation today again. It's a
Yeah, great fun
pleasure.
also.
Yeah. Thank you
Take
so
care.
much. Take care.
Bye bye.